Charlestown Landing is one of South Carolina's most popular parks, and for good reason. The park offers a store, museum, living history events, a replica sailing ship, zoo, gardens, bike rentals, headphone tour, the free Junior Ranger program, and venues for events. As one of the more advertised parks, some people misunderstand that while an important settlement, Charlestown was not the first settlement, but rather the first permanent settlement. In fact, the Spanish first came to what would be South Carolina in 1521, followed by the French in 1562. Prior to this, it is believed that around 30 tribes lived in what would be South Carolina. When these first Europeans arrived, some of the indigenous tribes left the Stone Age through trade. Unfortunately, this initial trade did expose these natives to new diseases, which eventually caused the death of many people. Across the pond in 1585, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I, also known as the Virgin Queen, sent Walter Raleigh to the New World. In honor of the Queen, the land he claimed he named Virginia. Eventually, for various reasons, by 1587, both the Spanish and the French had left South Carolina, though their presence remained relevant in other parts of America. By 1603, when Queen Elizabeth passed, possibly from blood poisoning, her closest relative, James, the son of Henry Stuart and Mary Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had beheaded, was given Elizabeth's crown. Notably, James I had previously went by James VI, as he was already King of Scotland. By 1607, King James had the first permanent English settlement established in America at Jamestown, Virginia. Unfortunately, James and then his son Charles I held to the strong belief in the divine right of kings, often clashing with Parliament over financial issues and politics. As a result, by 1642, the Civil War broke out between King Charles I, his son Prince Charles of Wales, and their supporters known as the Cavaliers, versus the Parliament and their supporters known as the Roundheads, and the Puritans under their leader Oliver Cromwell. Ultimately, the English Civil War was fought to determine who and how power would be wielded. During this war, the king, Charles I, was beheaded, and afterwards Oliver Cromwell ruled as the Lord Protector of England. During Cromwell's rule, Prince Charles did try to regain the crown in 1651, but after losing the Battle of Winchester, he went into exile and stayed at various places, even spending time with his cousin Louis XIV. During Cromwell's rule, many things occurred, such as gambling dens, theaters, and holidays being outlawed, as well as the persecution of Catholics. So, by the time that Oliver Cromwell passed from complications from malaria and kidney stones, much discussion was had. In 1659, Cromwell's son gave up his power, and by 1660, Charles II restored the English monarchy. After taking the throne, Charles II, the Merry Monarch, again legalized pubs, theaters, and holidays. He also had the already dead men responsible for his father's death hung, beheaded, and then their heads displayed on pikes on the roof of Westminster Hall for the next 25 to 30 years. By March 1663, in order to reward his supporters, many of whom supported his father in the English Civil War, 8 men, known as the Lord Proprietors, were gifted a vast amount of land, that Charles had named Carolina after himself. At that time, Carolina did not only consist of South Carolina and North Carolina, but also Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and parts of Florida. Notably, besides just being a reward, Charles II hoped that his gift would ensure the Lord Proprietors' continued support, and that their settlement would prove to be a good buffer between the Spanish-held Florida and the already English-settled Virginia. It was also during 1663 that planters in Barbados began looking for new lands in which to grow sugarcane and other crops. So a group of the planters commissioned Captain William Hilton to take the ship the Adventurer to scout out the land in Carolina. While exploring what would be South Carolina, Captain Hilton was so impressed with the beauty of the island, its sweet water and clear sweet air, that he named the area after himself. I find it interesting that one of the Lord Proprietors, John Colleton, had only recently left Barbados following Cromwell's death, as after the Civil War, as a king's supporter, his lands in England were seized. I have read that it is believed that Colleton later persuaded the wealthy Barbados planters, who he had spent time with during Cromwell's reign, to give the colony of Carolina a chance. And as a result, much of the Low Countries architecture can be attributed to them. Unfortunately, in 1663, even after Captain Hilton's account of the beautiful coast, the Lord Proprietors were not yet ready to settle Carolina. This was for several reasons, including the vastness and remoteness of the land, financial concerns, internal disagreements, and the presence of confrontational indigenous tribes. Meanwhile, in America, Virginia had made allies with a tribe made of various indigenous people known as the Westos. The Westos were feared by many of the other tribes, as they were armed by the Virginians and set out to collect native slaves. They would even travel as far as Georgia and Florida in their search. Of the Lord Proprietors, some say the man most responsible for shaping Carolina was Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper. Unlike most of the other proprietors, while he initially served King Charles I, he also worked in Parliament. As the war went on, Lord Ashley Cooper ended up working for Cromwell on his Council of State, with the task of helping frame a new constitution for England. During Cromwell's reign, Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper and many others found the fictional book, The Commonwealth of Oceania by James Harrington, an escape and inspiration. Notably, originally Cromwell tried to stop its publication, but after Harrington had Cromwell's daughter speak on his behalf, and Harrington decided to dedicate the book to Cromwell, Cromwell granted its publication. In the book, it talks about a made-up city built on top of a dead king, which is a republic island nation, and that is ruled by an ideal lawgiver. In Oceania, land ownership is limited to keep wealthy landowners from oppressing the people. In addition, in the book, it discusses the use of a secret ballot and the idea of limiting the time that a political official can stay in power. During this time, because Cromwell had outlawed taverns, coffee houses began to emerge, where people of all classes could come, socialize, and talk about the news and share ideas. Following Cromwell's death, Lord Ashley Cooper joined in the movement to restore the monarchy, and he even personally sailed to Holland to escort Charles II out of exile. In 1666, another English expedition was sent to the Carolina coast. This expedition was commanded by Captain Robert Stanford. During Stanford's trip, he met Chief Shadow and a Kusabo chief on Edisto Island, who showed him how to get to Port Royal Sound. He even met a Kiowa chieftain who promised a large welcome and plentiful entertainment and trade. While Stanford never took him up on his offer, the later English settlers would. While in the area, it was Stanford who actually named the Ashley River, and like Hilton, praised the area for its fertility and suitability. By 1667, Lord Ashley Cooper was one of the Cabal members, which was a secret group of 5 ministers who advised King Charles II. Sometime during this decade, Lord Ashley Cooper met John Locke through a mutual acquaintance. Locke eventually became Lord Ashley Cooper's personal aide, as they shared similar philosophies and both men believed in individual rights and civil liberties. By 1669, Lord Ashley Cooper, with the help of Locke, drew up the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina, which was the first governmental framework for the to-be 12th colony. This legal document outlined how society would operate. For example, the title of Landgrave would be given to someone who owned vast properties and was an overseer of other people. This title was then passed from father to son. In addition, the document pointed out how the colony would not tolerate religious persecution, and even mentions the rights of the indigenous people to worship who and how they chose. Eventually, after review, this document was signed by all of the Lord Proprietors. As Carolina was designed to harmonize with the English monarchy, that all of those going to Carolina would be required to pledge their fealty to the king and the Lord Proprietors. By August 1669, the Lord Proprietors were finally ready to send the first settlers. In doing so, they commissioned 3 ships, the Carolina, the Port Royal, and the Albemarle. Of these ships, the Carolina was the largest, but also the fastest, as it had 3 masts. When the ships departed, on their way to Barbados, they stopped in Ireland, where several people had already decided to leave the expedition. Upon leaving Ireland, after 40 days, the ship reached Barbados, where a storm destroyed the Albemarle. While in Barbados, the ship The Three Brothers took the Albemarle's spot. But another storm would eventually push the Big Brother to Virginia. In addition, while I'm unsure of the cause, sometime during the travels, the ship, the Port Royal, was abandoned. After leaving Barbados, the Carolina headed to Bermuda, where Sir John Yeamans, the man the proprietors had planned on being the first governor, abandoned the expedition to return to Barbados. During this time in Bermuda, the Carolina also had to undergo substantial repairs. While traveling, the settlers were under the command of Captain Joseph West and William Sale. William had been the governor of Bermuda, and prior to Sir John leaving, was chosen to be the first governor of Carolina. Many of the indentured servants on the Carolina ship grew weary of the torturous journey and wanted to turn back. But the governor threatened them with additional years of service, so they sailed on. While the settlers were traveling to Carolina, so too were the Westo tribe, who had finally been pushed out of their home by the more powerful Iroquois. In fact, the Westo only arrived to Carolina a short time before the settlers. Finally, in April of 1670, the Carolina arrived at the coastline. Originally, the settlers ended up in an area known as Bull's Bay, about 100 miles north of their desired destination of Port Royal. At Bull's Bay, a small group of natives watched them arrive. Fortunately, these people were very friendly and even traveled with the settlers to show them how to get to Port Royal. Once the settlers arrived at Port Royal, they were really concerned, as the leaders felt the location was too exposed to attack. On an invitation from the Kiowa chief, the Carolina ventured up the coast and into what would be the Charleston harbor, so as not to be an easy target for the Spanish who were constantly traveling the coast. Governor William and the settlers chose Albemarle Point on the Ashley River as their new home. These 93 settlers then fixed temporary structures while they built an earth and wooden fortification and their homes on Albemarle Point, named after George Monk, Duke of Albemarle. Interestingly, George Monk was one of the 8 Lord Proprietors, who was a general during the English Civil War and gained fame from leading a campaign in Ireland and defeating the Dutch at sea. Like Sir Ashley Cooper, eventually George Monk supported the Parliament and Oliver Cromwell. However, after Cromwell's death, Monk used his army to force Parliament to dissolve. The new Parliament invited Charles to take the throne, and the newly crowned Charles II named Monk the Duke of Albemarle. Under Charles II, George Monk served as the master of His Majesty's horses and captain general of all his forces. Besides the fortification for protection, the settlers were also armed with muskets, swords, spearheads, a dozen suits of armor, and other munitions. It didn't take long after the English arrived that the Spanish sent 3 ships to attack them, but luckily a hurricane drove the Spanish away. During their time at Albemarle Point, the New Carolinians faced many issues, including poor drinking water, lack of a breeze, mosquito-spread diseases, and they still felt too exposed to the Spanish. As a result, it didn't take long and the settlers moved to a new area south and away from the ocean, a place they called Charlestown Landing. This early period in Carolina history was also marked by Native Americans working alongside the English colonists in order to make alliances for trade and protection. Taking a lesson from the earlier settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, these settlers were prepared for trade and brought with them items like fishing nets, glass beads, and scissors. One of the important figures in the South Carolina colony at the time who helped establish native trade was Dr. Woodward. Henry was born in Barbados to William Woodward and Esther Martin. In 1666, he accompanied Stafford's expedition to Carolina and volunteered to stay with the Cusabo tribe to explore. The following year, Woodward was captured by the Spanish and taken to St. Augustine. While a prisoner, as a surgeon, he was treated well and learned about the Spanish Indian trading system. The next year, while John Davis, one of the earliest and most active English pirates, raided St. Augustine, Woodward escaped. In 1674, Woodward built relationships with the Westo tribe, and by 1677 built relationships with the Shawnee, who in Carolina were known as the Savannah. Of the 1670s settlers, one popular family was that of the Boone family. Major Boone came as a Lord Proprietor's deputy, a member of the Grand Council, and of the vestry of Christ Church. Major Boone, as well as his brother Joseph, were heavily engaged in colonial politics, and for many years the Boone's family were one of the most influential in the state. It was also during this initial period in 1670 that Governor William would reserve 600 acres on Oyster Point. Just prior to Governor William's death, a group from Barbados arrived, and 8 days later, a second group totaling 106 people. In early 1671, John West, the commander of the ships which brought the first settlers, was unanimously chosen as governor by the Colonial Council. By spring of 1671, the settlement agreed that they had ample reason to protest because they felt the Lord Proprietors were abusing their power in regards to land, trade, and the payment of an advance that the Lord Proprietors had given the people for food and supplies. To make matters worse, by December of that year, Sir John Yeamans, who had eventually arrived, claimed the governorship on the grounds that he had been made a landgrave. While the settlers trusted Governor West, they didn't feel the same about Sir John, as many believed he had murdered his wife's first husband. The council expressed themselves to the Lord Proprietors, saying that they were well satisfied with the administration of West. But shortly after, the Lord Proprietors made Sir John governor. West was then appointed as register of all writings and documents. During this time, those who spoke against the governor or the government were punished by being confined to a room, humiliated at the stockade, or tied to a tree and whipped. Eventually, Sir John's actions led to the Lord Proprietors also seeing him unfavorably, as he conducted private trade, made liberal use of the proprietors' credit without their approval, and profited off of the people during food shortages. So, by early 1674, as a hated man, Sir John decided to retire to Barbados, leaving the position of governor to West, whom by May was made a landgrave and the fourth governor. The following year, in 1675, one historical report tells of a native woman from Tennessee who was taken prisoner by the Westo and then traded for a gun at Charlestown. The woman escaped and returned to her home, where she told the chief and her people about the English village allied with the Westo. While slavery was practiced by both the English and the native peoples, there were various differences, and it didn't take long for the settlers to realize that native slaves did not work good for them, as they were often violent and it was easy for them to escape and go back to their original tribe. As a result, black slaves from Africa and the West Indies began being shipped to Carolina. By 1679, almost 10 years after Albemarle Point was established, the settlers increased to 1,000. As more settlers arrived, people began spreading out, making the peninsula a popular place. This is because people felt it was a more superior location for trade. So, Lord Ashley Cooper wrote a letter in which he advised the capital to move from Albemarle Point to Oyster Point, present-day Charleston. As a result, by 1680, Albemarle Point was abandoned. Notably, today, traces of the Albemarle Point settlement have disappeared. The site is included in a privately owned Old Towne plantation, where a monument was erected in 1909. Notably, while constructing the capital and port city, the settlers finally used Lord Ashley Cooper's plans, which were derived from the plans used during the reconstruction of London after the Great Fire. While not as widely talked about as the later mass importation of slaves, the export of native slaves from 1680 until the Yamasee War accounts for 40,000 indigenous men, women, and children being sent from Charlestown to the British West Indies
as well as other colonies in British North America. Profits from this early slave trade, as well as the export of products like beaver pelt, deer skins, and timber products, helped provide the economic foundation for the future state. Initially, the Carolina colony benefited by their allies, the fearsome Westo, as they were used as a barrier against the Spanish. But once Carolina had grown strong enough to protect itself, the Westos were seen as an impediment to the expansion of trade. As a result, by 1679, Carolina made allies with the Savannah Shawnees. The following year, in 1680, the Westo were decimated, and the Savannah Shawnee moved to their lands along the Savannah River. During this time of growth, the Lord proprietors claimed a monopoly on the native slave trade and forbade all trade with Native Americans and the Spanish, except by their official agents. This, along with the lack of protection Charlestown received from the Lord proprietors, of whom none had ever actually visited the colony, eventually led to the people beginning to pull away from their rule. As a Whig politician who strongly opposed the potential succession of James II of England to the throne, after being accused of high treason in 1682, Lord Ashley Cooper fled into exile to Holland, where shortly after he passed, effectively ending his influence over the Carolina colony. While the colony of Carolina began as the liberal project of Lord Ashley Cooper, the colony never forgot the important concepts of liberty and civil rights that Lord Ashley Cooper ingrained in its conception, ideals that future Carolinians would continue to hold close to their heart, and would eventually give the people the strength they needed to rebel against the king. A rebellion that would result in Charlestown changing its name from a name that once honored a king to the name of Charleston.